So the processing of the knitr document happens in a certain way. First, the R markdown document is processed and creates a markdown document. Then the markdown document is converted to HTML, and then the HTML file is what you view in the final product. Generally speaking, you do not want to edit or mess with any of those secondary documents. You don't want to edit the markdown document or the HTML document because those are automatically generated. If you edit them and then you reprocess the original document, all of your changes will be overwritten in the HTML file or in the markdown file. So only edit the R markdown file that contains the original text and the original R code. So here's another example. I've got my first knitr document. And I have my name there as the author, and I start a section called the introduction, and I say here's some text, here's a code chunk, and I name the code chunk simulation. And notice I added this option echo equals false. And so that indicates to knitr that I don't want the code for this code chunk to be echoed in the output document. I just want the result to show. So here I've got my level 1 heading indicated by the single hash, the level 2 heading indicated by the 2 hashes. I say don't echo the code. So now this is the output document. Again, you can see it looks like the original document that I had in the previous example, but I don't see the code. I only see the output, which is the mean. You can also hide the results too if you want to. In this case, it doesn't make too much sense, but you could do it by adding the results. The results equals hide option. And then when you see the output document, you see that all the text is there, but there's no code and there's no results. One of the nice things about a knitr document is that you can write sentences and text, and if you need to fill in a number or a statistic or some sort of computation in the middle of a sentence, you can just add that directly into a sentence. So for example, here I have a code chunk which computes the time, and using the systime function, and then I also generate a random number. Okay, and so now I can write a sentence. So that code chunk, I don't echo the code because I don't want people to see that code. What I want people to see is the sentence immediately after, which says the current time is, and then I'll just plug in the current time, and then the next sentence is my favorite random number is, and then I'll just plug in a random number. So here you can see the output is the current time is Wednesday, September 4th, and there's the time in 2013, and you can see my favorite random number is 1.1829. So that's how you can plug in computed variables or computed results in the middle in line with text. Another important aspect of any report probably is going to be some graphics. So you want to make plots of data or any sort of visualization. So you can easily add this into a knitr document. So here I've simulated some data, and then in the first code chunk I simulate some data, and then the second code chunk I make a plot. So I use the par function to set the the canvas with the margins and the LAS option, and then I call plot to generate the plot. And you notice I added an option here which adjusts the figure height, and so I say fig.height equals 4, which makes it a little bit squished more than usual, so it'll be a rectangular type of plot rather than a square plot. And so what knitr produces is a little bit interesting. It creates an HTML file through the processing. So you can see if you're familiar with HTML, you can see this is basic HTML. I cut off a lot of stuff on the top, so I just put the body in. And this is a basic HTML, and you can see that down here at the bottom you'll see there's an image tag, but rather than point to an actual file that's the image, it actually embeds the entire image into the HTML file itself. So you can see this is a base64 encoded image, and so actually this HTML file stands alone. It doesn't depend on any external image files, which is not necessarily the most efficient format, but it's actually quite useful because then you could take this HTML file, give it to someone else, and they don't have to worry about whether they have these other files or not, because everything's embedded. So here's the result. You can see I echo the R code. I have the result of the plot, and you can see it's kind of this rectangular shape, and that's my scatter plot. So another handy thing you can do in a knitr document is make a table. And often you want to make a table that summarizes the result of some calculation like a regression model. So here I have a code chunk which loads some data, and I fit a linear regression model to it. Here I'm modeling ozone concentrations as a function of wind, temperature, and solar radiation. And I want to summarize the output from this linear regression model in a kind of pretty format, so not just your standard kind of R model format. So I'm going to use the XTable package, which is available on CRAN. You have to install it separately. It doesn't come with R. And I'm going to use the XTable function to summarize the fit, and I'll print it to an HTML. You can see that in the resulting HTML output, after I process it with knitr, I get the code that I ran for the regression model, and it echoes the code. But at the very bottom here, I can see that I've got a table of regression coefficients, standard errors, t-values, and p-values, which is formatted in HTML, and so it'll be kind of in a prettier format rather than standard text mode. So sometimes you want to set options for the entire document, so these are called global options. And you want these options to apply to every single code chunk. So maybe if you never want to echo the code, for example, you want every code chunk to say echo equals false. Well, it can be a bit of a pain to have to specify every single code chunk, so you might want to set a global option for something like that. And so the way you can do that is you can create a separate code chunk in the very beginning of the document. Here I call it set options, and you can modify. There's a special object called ops_chunk. Which has a function built into it called set, and if you call that set function, you can set the global options. So here I can set echo equal to false, and I've set the result equal to hide. So by default, every code chunk in this document will not echo not echo the code, and it will hide the results. So here I've got some code chunks here. I simulate some data. I make a plot. But when I see the HTML output, let me go back. I see, first of all, in the first code chunk, I overrided the default for the echo, so I want to echo equals to true. And then for the second code chunk, I don't want to echo the plotting code, and so I let the default occur. So here, the code that generates the data is echoed, but the code that creates the plot is not echoed. So some of the common options that are good to remember, of course you can always go back to the documentation on the knitr website. So the results can be specified as either hide or as is. As is means don't post-process the results, just show the raw results from whatever the output is. Echo can be true or false, so if you want to echo the code or not. For figures, usually you might want to modify the height and the width to be a specific type of size. So fig.height and fig.width are common options to set there. So one special case is when you have a code chunk and the computation takes a really long time to run. Now every time you process the knitr document to look at the HTML output, you're going to have to run this computation. So one strategy to avoid having to sit around and wait a long time is to cache the computation. And so caching computations can be very useful for kind of complex code chunks. And so the idea is that for each code chunk, there's a special option called cache. You can set cache equal to true, and what will happen is that for that code chunk, the first time you process the document, it will have to run the code in order to figure out what the output is. But then what it will do is it will store that output on the disk, and so that the next time you process the document, as long as nothing has changed, it will load the results from the disk, which is typically a lot faster than having to redo all the computations again. So this will save you a lot of time if you're doing this over and over again. So if the data or the code or something changes, then you will have to rerun the code again. There's really no getting around that. And so the caching will kind of update to represent the new results. If one code chunk depends on another code chunk that was previous to it, this dependency is not explicitly tracked by default, and so you'll have to make sure that if a previous code chunk has a dramatic change to it, and a downstream code chunk depends on it, then you rerun everything so that the cache doesn't get mixed into it. Chunks with significant side effects may not be cacheable, so if the code in a chunk has some effect that's kind of outside the document, then it may not be possible to cache that. So just to summarize, I talked about knitr in this lecture, which is a useful tool for doing literate statistical programming. That will allow you to put text, code, and data and output all in one document. It uses a markdown formatting language, which is kind of very simple and easy to learn, and it creates HTML documents that you can view in any web browser. So I think it's a powerful tool for integrating text and code. As I mentioned before, there's pros and cons. It's not a perfect tool, but it may be useful to learn, and it's for generating reproducible reports.